what we can do while we're waiting is perhaps just have those panelists that are on with us give yourself a quick introduction to the group that got on early. They get a quick preview of who's on with us and get to see all of your lovely faces a little bit more.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Marita Garrett, Mayor of Wilkinsburg, a borough in Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, located next to the city of Pittsburgh. So happy to be here this afternoon and really want to give a shout out to ULI for the invitation to be a part of today's panel.
So thrilled to have you with us, Marita. Leonard, would you like to introduce yourself? I'll call people out so it's not.
Sure. Thank you. I'm Leonard Hoops. I'm the president and CEO of Visit Indy, the Indianapolis Destination Marketing Organization. So we do all the conventions, trade shows, big sporting events, and tourism for Indianapolis. Nice to be here today.
Thanks, Leonard. Emmett?
Good morning, all. Emmett Pearson Jr., President and CEO of Community Builders of Kansas City. We are a not-for-profit community development corporation doing community and economic development in chronically distressed communities. And thanks for having me, and a special shout out to ULI, KC, my colleagues that will be listening.
Thanks so much, Emmett. Jeffrey, would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, Jeffrey McMichael, Senior Tax Manager at Cohen & Company.
Wonderful. Gus?
I'm Gus Faucher. I'm the Chief Economist at PNC Bank in Pittsburgh.
Wonderful. Michael?
Good afternoon, Mike Taylor. I am the Regional Senior Director of Business Development for Comcast here in the Keystone region of the I guess the country, and glad to be a part of it today. Thank you, ULI, for hosting this event.
Oh, thank you for joining us. And finally, Jason, I think, is the last panelist we have.
Good morning, everyone. Jason Paulatier. I am the Market Manager for Community and Economic Development at Fifth Third Bank, covering Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois, and I am pleased to be here with you all today.
Wonderful. We'll give it 2 minutes before we give the official kickoff to give everybody some time, but so glad to have you all with us this morning. And for those of you who are already joining us, welcome. We're so glad to have you here. Hope that you joined us last week. This is going to be a great continuation of that conversation. Okay, we are going to get started. My name is Shannon Sclafani from ULI, Michigan. I have been heading up the District Council for the last 14 years, and I am so thrilled to have all of you here joining us in what is a little bit different of a format than we've ever had an Emerging Trends event. I am so thrilled that many of you were able to join us last week for the presentation of the Emerging Trends report, a great regional response panel followed up by all of your local experts to give you insight. Today is going to be a fantastic continuation of what that presentation was last week. We've got some great information coming up for you about an economic forecast, what the recovery is going to look like, and insight from all of our cities to understand what we might be able to expect in 2021. I want to start off by giving a huge thank you to all of the ULI staff in Pittsburgh, Michigan, Indiana, and Kansas City. You have been amazing and have been able to pull off such a wonderful collaborative effort for this event. And I know that everybody is going to benefit from all of that hard work. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to our sponsors for this event. Without your help, we would not be able to do the programming or events and provide the community support that ULI is known for. So thank you very much to Millhouse, Cohen & Company, Cityscape Residential, Valebridge Property Advisors, SME, CEC, and Associated Bank. And finally, thank you so much to all of our members. All of you are who make ULI the valuable organization that it is. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to one of our sponsors, Jeffrey McMichael from Cohen and Company, who is going to introduce to you the first session for today.
Thank you very much, Shannon, and thank you everyone for logging in and being here today. And a special thank you, like Shannon said, to the entire staff at ULI for being responsive and still keeping up with the content and the exciting content we have here, even during these COVID times. So as Shannon said, I'm a senior tax manager at Cohen and Company. We are a full service CPA firm. We're a top 40 firm. Geographies are Detroit, heavily in Ohio. We have an office in Pittsburgh, Chicago, and then New York and Milwaukee. Like I said, we're a full service CPA firm. We do everything, but we specialize in tax. We lead with tax. Specifically, our real estate construction practice is around a quarter of our entire firm. Heavily involved in tax credits, historic deals, new market tax credits, renewable.
Jeffrey, I think you may have gone on mute.
It's my internet is bad. Am I good now?
You are back.
Okay, great. My wife is downstairs on a Peloton, so that takes up some Wi-Fi. So I don't know where I stopped being heard, but as I was saying, we're a tax-specific firm. We do a lot with new markets, tax credits, historic tax credits, renewable energy, and then other financing structures. And the last thing I was discussing was the PPP program has been heavily on the mind of a lot of our clients, a lot of people on this phone call, I'm sure too. So we've been doing a lot of work in that space and dealing with the new legislation as it comes and the new rules as they come day-to-day basis. So today I'm very honored to be able to host this meeting and to introduce Gus, the chief economist at PNC, to give us an outlook and some predictions as to what the economy is going to be. We have a vaccine, so I'm hopeful. I hope a lot of people are. And without further ado, Gus, go ahead. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to lead off. I'm going to talk about the U.S. economic outlook, and then we'll be talking with our panelists. Big part, encourage you, there is a Q&A button at the bottom. So if you have questions for me or for any of our panelists, please feel free to go ahead and ask them. So we'll try to get to all of those, as many as we can, once we wrap up with our prepared discussions. So right now, the United States is in the early stages of what appears to be an economic recovery. We had a very severe contraction in the U.S. economy in the late winter, early spring because of the pandemic and the government restrictions on economic activity. But since the spring, we have seen economic activity pick up. Now, that doesn't mean that the economy is good. We still have high unemployment. We still have millions of job losses. We still have many people who are struggling. But the economy is doing better than it was in April and in May, and we've seen continued progress. And it's unfortunate that we did have this economic downturn than we did. The U.S. economy was in good shape in late 2019, early 2020. Before the pandemic came, if you had asked me if I thought the U.S. economy would have continued growing throughout 2020, I would have said yes, that the economic fundamentals were pretty good. And in fact, the economic expansion that ended in February had been the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. It had lasted more than 10.5 years. And especially it had been the most recent, past couple of years for the U.S. economy had been quite good. We saw the unemployment rate move below 4%. We saw a lot of competition for workers, and we saw businesses raising pay. And so, in fact, in 2019, we had some of the strongest income growth on record, and not just for households at the top end, but also for households in the middle of the income distribution and for households toward the bottom of the income distribution. We had very broad-based economic growth because of that very long expansion that we had a very low unemployment rate. So it's very unfortunate that the downturn came when it did. So the good news is that we have had a very aggressive response from both the federal government and the Federal Reserve. And so we have started to see a rebound in economic activity. In particular, when the pandemic first hit, we saw the Federal Reserve cut short-term interest rates, the Fed funds rate. That's their key policy rate. They pushed that back down to zero, where it was in the aftermath of the Great Recession a decade or so ago. And then we also saw the Federal Reserve push down long-term interest rates as well. So the Federal Reserve has been buying long-term bonds. They've been buying mortgage-backed securities. So that's pushed down long-term interest rates. The 30-year fixed mortgage rate, for example, has fallen below 3%. Borrowing costs for businesses have fallen dramatically. And that's really that's helped contributed to that recovery. And in particular, it's helped contribute to a recovery in certain sectors of the real estate market, in particular residential real estate. With very low mortgage rates, we're seeing a surge in home buying. We're seeing a surge in home building. The commercial market is a little, bit more scrambled because we're not quite sure how things are going to play out there. But we have seen it in a very aggressive action from the Federal Reserve. We've also seen a strong rebound in financial markets. So the S&P 500 is flirting with record highs recently. The stock market is forward-looking. It is looking at expectations for corporate profits 6 months, 9 months, 12 months down the road. And so it is fair to say that right now financial markets are pricing in continued recovery and growth in the U.S. economy. Obviously, in the immediate near term, things are looking pretty dicey with rising caseloads for the coronavirus, rising hospitalizations, and so forth. But I think the expectation is that we will get through this very difficult period over the next few months, that a vaccine is on the horizon, that we may start, in fact, to see people get inoculated against the coronavirus later this month in the United States. And then we'll have more widespread vaccination next year, and that will contribute to an economic recovery as people are able to go out or able to spend money and so forth. So financial markets are pricing in expectations for stronger economic growth over the next year or two. About 1/2 of the U.S. economy is at risk from the coronavirus. So we've seen this with the contraction that we had earlier in 2020. Obviously, there are parts of the economy that are less susceptible to the pandemic. So federal government spending, for example, that's actually increased. Consumer spending on non-durables goods, food, clothing, those types of things. Households continue to make those purchases. And in fact, people are buying more food because they're eating at home more and eating out less. Things like rent, utilities, healthcare. Consumers need to continue to make those kinds of purchases. But the rest of the US economy really suffered from the coronavirus pandemic in early 2020. Consumer spending on durable goods, those are cars and big ticket items. And I know that automobile manufacturing is especially important for Michigan, for Indiana, for the Kansas City area. And that really suffered from the downturn in spending that we had earlier this year. Business investment is at risk. So we've seen a lot of businesses cut back, and obviously, commercial construction is an important part of business investment. And so we saw a contraction there. We did see an initial contraction in home building as job sites shuttered, but as I mentioned, we've seen a bounce back there. And then also exports. This is a global pandemic. We saw shutdowns earlier in the year in many parts of the globe. We're now starting to see shutdowns in parts of Western Europe as the pandemic rises again there. And so exports are at risk. So it is fair to say that about 1/2 of the US economy suffered earlier this year from the pandemic and is at further risk because of the renewed restrictions on economic activity that we're starting to see in some states because of consumer unwillingness to go out. But the good news is that we have started to see a rebound in many parts of the US economy. So if we look, for example, at restaurant spending. That fell by about 55% between February and April. So it fell by more than half over a period of just a couple months. And it has since come back, still not close to where it was before the pandemic, but we're starting to see gains there. Auto sales, as I mentioned, that's a very important industry for many of the regions that we're featuring on this call today. We saw a huge drop. Auto sales fell by 50% between February and April. People weren't going out. Car dealerships were closed. The automakers shut down production. But since then, we've seen a very strong rebound in auto sales, and that is helping to support the recovery in Michigan, in Indiana, in the Kansas City area. And auto sales are back close to where they were before the pandemic. A big reason there, very low interest rates on car loans, because the Federal Reserve has cut borrowing costs in an effort to get consumers to go out and spend. I mentioned that housing has been a big driver of the recovery that we've seen. So for example, we saw existing home sales fall by about 40% from February to April. They're now back above where they were before the pandemic. People are more interested in purchasing a single family home. Perhaps they're less interested in city living because of the pandemic. So we've seen a very strong rebound in home sales. And in fact, the rebound would be even stronger if there were more inventory on the market. But there's a dearth of existing homes for sale. Similarly, we've seen a very strong rebound in new home building. So developers shut down job sites in the first wave of the pandemic, but as we figured out how to respond to that, we've seen home building respond. And again, very low mortgage rates, and that's supporting purchases of new homes, that's supporting development of new homes, and that's really contributing to the economic recovery that is underway at this point. And the big reason why we're seeing this improvement in the economy is because of all the stimulus that the federal government provided to households, to businesses in the early stages of the pandemic. So the federal government provided more than $2 trillion in stimulus to the economy in the late winter, early spring, as it became apparent that this pandemic would hit the economy really hard. And in particular, we saw a big increase in household income in the United States. So in the late winter, early spring, we saw the federal government mail out those checks to many households. And so that allowed those households to maintain or even increase their spending with the pandemic. We saw the federal government make more people eligible for unemployment insurance. You have your self-employed, your independent contractors, your gig workers like your Uber and Lyft drivers. They received unemployment when previously they wouldn't have been eligible. And then the federal government also provided an extra $600 per week in unemployment insurance benefits to beneficiaries. And that for many beneficiaries, that actually allowed them to have income that was higher than it was before when they were working. And so these transfers have made a huge increase in household income. We actually saw household income in April about 10% higher than it was in February. Now, over that same February to April period, 22 million people lost their jobs in the United States. But at the same time, household income went up, even with that huge loss in money coming in from the labor market. And that's because of those stimulus programs. Now, we have seen household income decline somewhat since then. We got those one-time checks in the spring, and those have one time, obviously, so that those aren't boosting households now. We've seen those extra unemployment insurance benefits expire, and then the Trump administration worked with states to reinstate them, but those have expired again, and now there's concern that 12 million people could lose their benefits at the end of this year. But still, household income now is higher than it was in February before the pandemic. And so all of that has made an enormous difference to the US economy, and it's really allowed consumers to increase their spending. Consumer spending makes up about 2/3 of US GDP. There are some parts of consumer spending on what we call durable goods, big ticket items, spending on non-durable goods. Those are actually higher than they were before the pandemic, as we see people going out and spending their stimulus checks, spending their unemployment insurance benefits. And so that's really supported this recovery that we are seeing in the US economy right now, and that's made a huge difference. At the same time, we had a lot of aid to small and medium-sized businesses. In particular, we had the Paycheck Protection Program, where the Federal Reserve provided very low interest loans to small and medium-sized businesses. And those loans will in fact turn into grants. It will be money from the federal government if those small and medium-sized businesses meet certain requirements in terms of keeping workers on their payrolls and maintaining their pay levels. And that's made a huge difference, and that's allowed many of those small and medium-sized businesses to stay open. PNC did a survey of small and medium-sized businesses in the fall. 97% of the businesses that took these Paycheck Protection Program loans said that it was important to their survival. So that's made a huge difference, and that's allowed for a very strong rebound in the job market. As I mentioned, we saw 22 million jobs lost between February and April as many of these businesses shut down, but with support from the federal government, through the Paycheck Protection Program, with consumers increasing their spending, we have seen the US economy add back about 12 million of those jobs, more than half of the jobs lost. Now, certainly we've made a lot of progress there, but we're still down by about 10 million jobs from where we were before the pandemic. And I think it is going to be more difficult to see job growth going forward than what we've had so far. In the initial stages of the recovery, as businesses reopened, many of them brought their workers back on. So those workers were on temporary layoff and they've been rehired. But most of that has come to an end. I think we've seen more permanent job losses, and it's more difficult for workers who have lost their jobs permanently to be rehired. And the longer their unemployment lasts, the more difficult it is for them to find a new job. So that is going to be, I would expect to see slower job growth going forward there, and just fewer business reopenings at this point. We've gotten a lot of the low-hanging fruit in the early stages of the labor market recovery, but it's going to be more difficult to see those job gains going forward. Similarly, the unemployment rate, which was 3.5% in February, that jumped up to almost 15% in April. That's the highest unemployment rate we've seen in the United States since the Great Depression back in the 1930s. The unemployment rate fell to 6.8% in November. We just got that number last week. So certainly a significant improvement there. We've seen that unemployment rate fall by about 8 percentage points. But we still are well above the 3.5% unemployment rate that we saw in early 2020. So we have a lot of ways to go there before the job market gets back to normal. And, we do face difficulties, as I mentioned, in the near term. We do have rising caseloads. We are starting to see states put additional restrictions on economic activity again. So, for example, California is starting to place more restrictions on businesses. We're seeing that in many parts of the country is we're concerned about health systems being overrun. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of that stimulus has expired. We do have 12 million households that are set to lose 12 million individuals who are set to lose unemployment insurance benefits at the end of this year. And that could be a significant drag on consumer spending. If those people, what's allowing them to maintain their spending are those unemployment insurance benefits. So to the extent that those benefits are delayed or disrupted, then that could cause a pullback in consumer spending. So I think the outlook in the immediate near term over the next few months is for much weaker economic growth. But that being said, I do think that we will see stronger economic growth as we head into 2021. As I do expect that we will see additional stimulus from Congress. I think that the news on a vaccine is very encouraging. And as I mentioned, we start to see people get inoculated against the coronavirus at some point later this year, in late this year and then throughout 2021. And that will allow people to go back out again, will make people feel more comfortable, will allow businesses to reopen and all that kind of stuff. And then we continue to get help from the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is committed to keeping interest rates very low both in the near term, but also over the medium term. The Federal Reserve wants the economy to get back to where it was before the pandemic. The Fed is not terribly concerned about inflation right now. Inflation is very low. In fact, it's lower than the Federal Reserve would like. So they want to have a strong recovery, in particular a strong recovery in the labor market that would allow for a bit of wage growth and a bit of inflation and push inflation back toward the Federal Reserve's inflation target of 2%. So I think the Federal Reserve will be keeping interest rates low for an extended period of time. So our basic forecast for the next year or so is that I do think that we will continue to see the economy expand in the near term, but growth is going to be significantly weaker than it was in the third quarter of 2020 and even the first part of the fourth quarter of 2020. I think that we're going to see consumers start to buckle down a little bit and perhaps be a little more cautious. But I do think that economic growth will pick up as we finish up the winter next year and then start into the spring and the weather gets better and the vaccine becomes more prevalent. The unemployment rate, which I mentioned, was 6.8% in November. I think it's going to stay around there this year, maybe be flat in the near term through the early part of 2021. But then I think we will see more significant improvement in the labor market in the second, third, and fourth quarters of 2021 and see that unemployment rate fall to perhaps below 6% by the end of next year and then to around 5% by the end of 2022. So continued improvement, but still an unemployment rate above that 3.5% that we saw at the beginning of 2020 before the pandemic. In terms of real estate markets, I think that the single family housing market will continue to do quite well. I think that mortgage rates will remain extremely low for well into 2021. I think that there is strong demand for single family housing, that people are looking to perhaps move out of the cities and move into the suburbs, and that will support demand for single family homes. In terms of commercial real estate markets, the picture is more mixed. Obviously, we've had enormous disruptions. Even before the pandemic, we were seeing sales transition from in-person brick and mortar to online. That process accelerated with the pandemic. I know that we're all buying more on Amazon and having more shipped to our homes so we don't have to go out. And so the retail real estate market, which was already suffering before the pandemic, has taken an even bigger hit with the pandemic. And there's no going back there. I think that people will continue to buy more online and that is going to put continued pressure on retail real estate markets. On the other hand, it's increasing demand for other types of commercial real estate. So industrial space, for example, there's strong demand there. We're building more warehouses as we ship more goods because of increasing online sales. So industrial space is quite strong. The office market, that's a lot of questions about that. Perhaps we get a vaccine and people start to go back to the office. And conditions return to normal by late 2021 or early 2022. On the other hand, there is the potential that this could be a structural shift in the demand for office space, that many of us will continue to work at home at least a few days a week, that there'll be more office sharing and that type of thing. And so it could be that the demand for office space is structurally lower and we just have too much office space out there, and it will take a lot of time to work that off. So it'll be interesting to see what our panelists and what our attendees have to say about that, because at this point it's still an open question as to what exactly is going to happen to the commercial real estate market and the office market in particular. But our forecast is for a bit of softer growth in the near term, but stronger growth as we head into the spring of 2021. Again, kind of a slower improvement in the labor market in late 2020, early 2021, but then stronger growth as a vaccine becomes available, and then continued expansion in the US economy in the second half of 2021 and throughout 2022. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I am going to, excuse me, let me pull up my notes here. I would like, at that point, I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to ask each of our guests to talk a little bit about what it is that he or she does, and then in particular, what issues they're seeing and what in particular is going on with the pandemic. And so we are going to start with Marita Garrett, and Mayor Garrett is from Wilkinsburg, not too far from where I am in the Pittsburgh area. And she is the mayor of the Wilkinsburg Bureau. So Mayor Garrett, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Gus. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you to the team at ULI for having me on this afternoon. So as Gus had mentioned, my name is Marita Garrett. I am mayor of Wilkinsburg Borough, which neighbors the city of Pittsburgh. We're 2.2 square miles with a population of 16,000, predominantly Black community. And in our pre-panel call yesterday, try to scroll through, remember, but Emmett had shared that he actually read about us in Dr. Andre Perry's book. So one of the things I wanted to share a little bit about Wilkinsburg and some of the challenges that we've been facing in this global pandemic, and just giving that kind of overall background information, is that we are a community that has faced decades of disinvestment. So meaning that at one time in Wilkinsburg's heyday, the 40s and 50s, it was a booming, bustling community that was the place for everyone to go, even from the city of Pittsburgh and throughout the region. But due to numerous things, flight to the suburbs, steel mill decline, all of those things left Wilkinsburg really decimated. But over the past 10, 15 years, we've really been building up Wilkinsburg so that there is that reinvestment period. And what we're actually saying is Wilkinsburg is facing a renaissance. That's what we're experiencing, a sense of renewal, not only in our residents, but in access to education, in the main streets, business redevelopment, all of those different things. And all of these things were, I'm sure as in everyone else's markets, were, moving steadily, and then 2020 hit. So when you also are talking about redevelopment efforts and, investment in what these markets look like, that of being an elected official that represents the community people, the focus also is addressing the immediate needs of our constituents as well too. So how does this all, really play out? And one of my interests is, or one of my passions, I should say, is responsible community and economic development. So as I said, Wilkinsburg had many decades of disinvestment. And what's interesting is that the disinvestment more so came from public servants or elected officials of past administrations. In our region, the Pittsburgh region, there's been a lot of redevelopment efforts, and immediately everyone uses the G word, gentrification. But what you really have to break down is, what is it about gentrification? It's the negative effect of gentrification, which is displacement, that concerns people. And so in this case, in the case of, kind of the neighboring communities in Pittsburgh, what's considered displaced people are the buildings that have come in and, getting rid or moving out the mom and pop stores, or increasing high rents and rates where it's harder for people to live in these communities. Whereas in Wilkinsburg, one of the things that led to our displacement was increasing of school taxes. So it wasn't a new shiny building coming in. It wasn't that rent had increased or these kind of markets increased. It was actually that our taxes continue to rise and rise. And that's a very important, very important tool to look at when we're talking about, concerns related to gentrification and displacement, is the taxes. That if people feel that they can't afford to stay within a community, not necessarily because they're feeling pushed out, but they're feeling pushed out because the taxes have increased. So that has resulted in a high number of blighted and vacant properties within Wilkinsburg. But thankfully, working with some of our leaders, our fellow community leaders like the Wilkinsburg Community Development Corporation, and having great connections and relationship with our County Economic Development Department, we've been able to utilize different programs such as vacant property recovery programs, which offers properties for really or for a person or entity to acquire it at fair market value without having to worry about the back taxes. So between a mixture of all of those things is really key in regards to, you know, having that buffer for further disinvestment, or in this case, displacement. Me specifically, why community-led why community-led development is so important to me, it's crucial, is you need development to come from within the community, because obviously it's going to be the community members and the leaders and the stakeholders who have its best interest. So for example, a project that I've been working on is called the Hunter Building, the Hunter Building Project. And the Hunter Building in Wilkinsburg is the largest commercial building in downtown Wilkinsburg with about 22,000 square feet. It sits right at the corner of our two main thoroughfares, Penn Avenue and Wood Street. And essentially what is needed, I mean, so much is needed, but essentially with this project being led by myself and another resident, specifically another Black Wilkinsburg resident, Derek Tillman, is showing that, you know, we don't have to outsource to big firms in Chicago or New York, which are great firms as well too, but we can also, but more so as developing this project, we can really speak to, you know, what the needs are within our community. One of those things, we don't have a coffee shop. Now, obviously it's COVID-19 right now, so we're not really doing too much of community in-person gatherings, but we all know that coffee shops are really that hubs in our community that bring people together and really, you know, provide that people space. Additionally, having mixed use, you know, so that our small business owners can have a place to, you know, launch their businesses, not necessarily just inside their homes. And then also professional office spaces for maybe those financial services firms or architect companies that want to come into our region. So when we're talking about, you know, kind of where we have been, especially to 2020, 2020 has highlighted, you know, what hasn't worked, right? I think we all can say that. So I really, you know, encourage us all to try to find somewhat of that hope in moving forward, that, you know, 2020 definitely has been a challenging year, but we know what doesn't work. So what happens if we actually, you know, dream a little bigger or aim a little higher, just work outside our usual boxes and come up with some innovative solutions that really support our communities. So, you know, I really look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists about some of their thoughts, ideas, what's going on in their region, and even coming out of this group from listening to some of the attendees as well, solutions that we can work on for the future. So thank you again for having me.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mayor Garrett. And now we're going to turn to Mike Taylor. He is the Regional Senior Director of Business Development for Comcast, and he's also based in Pittsburgh. So Mike, if you want to talk a little bit about what you've been seeing and the impact of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Gus, and good afternoon, everyone. And I'm so excited to be with you this afternoon. As Gus has stated, I am Mike Taylor, the Senior Director of Business Development for Comcast in the Keystone region, which really encompasses Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Maryland, but particularly here in Pittsburgh, certainly vested in this community and in our interest in continuing the recovery of the pandemic. Just wanted to share a little bit about kind of what I do. In my role, I am particularly responsible for identifying and managing our broadband expansion in the footprint aforementioned. Our goal at Comcast is to be the great, I guess, equalizer, if you will, in the footprint we spoke about. Our goal is to really help those underserved communities with receiving data and broadband to have it available at every household across the country. And we recognize that there's real power in expanding our footprint and network to those who desire and, quite frankly, deserve the very best product. So we're very much committed in the space to help solve for the digital divide that impacts so many today. As certainly as we live in this new world that we live in, it's become more evident how important it is for access to broadband for everyone. And so my job every single day is to look across that wide geography and identify needs and to figure out mathematically and profitably how we can go about doing that. And so you may or may not know, but Comcast invested just recently over $20 million in the downtown Pittsburgh area alone to provide the best data and product available, also linear television, as well as a slew of other products that we can talk about in greater detail later on. But I think it's important to also share with you that this work is not easy. You can probably imagine trying to coordinate surveys and permitting, and from the beginning to the end. This requires a tremendous amount of coordination from a lot of work groups. So part of my other responsibility, once we figure out kind of where we're going to invest and build and expand, is to from the end customer experience, end customer viewpoint, I guess, it is to make certain we have a seamless process from beginning to end, that we are coordinated, that the customer has great understanding of our processes, that should something go awry, and of course we hope it doesn't, but if it should, that you have a face and a point of contact. And I want to make sure that that we're taking great dignity and care to make these products available to all. And so we want to share, we want there to be as minimal disruption, I guess, as possible, obviously, which means I have to be that much more aligned with partnering with my work groups internally and external partners as well, to make certain this feels seamless to the end user. And third and finally, I would say this really around this whole customer experience space, making the customer this a great experience for all. This is really priority number one for me from a Turner perspective. So we're going to spend a lot of time constructing and permitting. There's a lot that goes on behind the curtain type work that needs to get done. But even from a customer facing standpoint, at the end of the day, my customers are the residents of these communities. And so, we pay very close attention to the individual homes and business owners and want that Turner process to be seamless. And the actual turning on of services and providing technicians to get there, to get the services running. And so for me, having that feedback loop and forums like this is very, very important, that we drive an excellent customer experience down to the resident level. So that's the work that I do for a living. Excited about this work, with hopes that to provide great value proposition to the general community as we do this, and if nothing else, to give you solace in knowing that how seriously we take this work that we do to make our products available to everyone, so that everyone has an equal opportunity to learn, to educate, to work, and to do all of the things that make our lives meaningful and purposeful. So with that, I'll pause and turn it back over to you, Gus, to introduce our next panelist.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate that. And now we're going to go to Indianapolis and Leonard Hoops, who is the president and CEO of Visit Indy, which is the local tourism convention group in central Indiana. Thank you.
Thank you, Gus. It's a pleasure to join you all today. And we are obviously one of the industries, the convention, trade show, and tourism world, that hasn't done particularly well during the pandemic. In fact, we've done very poorly. To give you some context, and I'll give you some sense of what we think is going to happen in the foreseeable future. Indianapolis back in 2014 was rated the #1 convention city in America by USA Today. And they have not yet ever updated their rankings. And so we're happy with that, because we stayed #1 for 6 or 7 years in a row now. And it's not about, in our case, not about the number of events we get, but more the quality. And we've got 12 hotels connected by skywalks to our convention center, and some other things like that make us really a unique convention destination. which is one way of pointing out that we are very group dependent, and groups are not what is happening during the pandemic. And so it has been particularly impactful on our economy. Indianapolis's economy is very much, our industry is very much tied into its strengths or weaknesses. During past downturns, our group business dependency has actually helped us mitigate that impact better than others. If you're talking about 9/11 or 2008 financial crisis, but in a pandemic, it has exacerbated the situation. So it's been a tough year. Like most destinations, we didn't have any business at all mid-March through June. We are actually one of a handful of destinations beginning in July that has been having some level of events. We've required that groups get approved health and safety plans from the Marion County Public Health Department. And in most cases, those are the same basic things that you would expect in an event: a health and safety plan, masks, social distancing, obviously lots of things like of sanitizer everywhere. But we've also upgraded our HVAC system to a hospital grade air system, and done some other upgrades to the building, $7 million worth, that have made those events safer. And we've now had more than 20 events, totaling more than 50,000 attendees between July and Thanksgiving week. Thanksgiving week, we actually had 2,000 Irish dancers that were supposed to be in Chicago, but under Illinois rules, they couldn't. So they moved to Indy, filed a plan, had it approved, and had that event. And so when we've had events in the building, we've been as high as third in the top 25 markets for hotel occupancy for Friday, Saturday nights. And when we've not had those events, we've been as low as 23rd out of 25 markets. So there's a big gap between us having, for the downtown hotel markets at least. And so again, we've not done it willy-nilly. We've done it with approved health and safety plans, and it's been critical to our success. Not really, success is too strong of a word. It's been critical to us keeping some businesses alive until vaccines can be rolled out, and that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully, that light is not a moving train. Looking forward into the near future, we're actually quite bullish on the next couple of months. Beginning in mid-January, we have a 25,000 person, or at least it historically has been 25,000 people. It'll be smaller, I'm sure, in January, called Jam Fest. It's a cheerleading event. More than likely, under the current conditions, they'll be required to do things like do a COVID test 72 hours before they arrive, and then once they get on site, they'll have the rapid antigen tests, which are not that accurate, but everything you can do mitigates the impact as much as possible. Followed by, and that's the second weekend of January, we then have 3 straight weekends of major volleyball tournaments. In some cases, they're already scheduled for Indy. In other cases, they are relocations from other places where they don't anticipate they could be held. That's followed by a USA Gymnastics major tune-up event for selecting the team that will go to Tokyo for the Olympics. If you recall, the Tokyo Olympics were pushed back a year, and so these things kind of have to get reset. Right after that, we have the NFL Combine, which has been in Indianapolis every year since 1987, and that's still on track, and the NFL has its own protocol. Then we've got one more volleyball, and then some of you may have read that the Indianapolis is right now in negotiations. In fact, I was on calls all morning on various aspects of this with the NCAA to host potentially the entire NCAA men's Division I basketball tourney in Indy, not just the Final Four, which we were already scheduled to do, but the first 4 games, the first and second rounds, the regionals, and the Final Four. And that's a logistics challenge, to say the least, because we did have existing groups over their dates that we have to reaccommodate in some way, shape, or form. There's negotiations going on between the hotels and the NCAA. There are venues that need to be found to play the games. The convention center has to be turned into practice courts and gymnasiums and things of that nature. But long story short, we look at that as failure is not an option, and we plan on figuring out how to make that work for all parties. And then after that event, we've got a little bit of a lull, some smaller business, but then the Indy 500 is the Memorial Day weekend right before June. And most of you probably are aware that the Operation Warp Speed director has talked about his belief that every American who wants the vaccine would have access to the vaccine by June. And so we are bullish that with the kickoff of the Indy 500 over Memorial Day through the entire rest of 2021, we've got convention business pretty much every week, conventions and trade shows through mid-December of next year. And so we know it won't recover all the way back to 2019 levels in 1 year. It'll take several years, but we do think there'll be a steep improvement in our industry moving forward. And one of the reasons I say that is I was asked a couple of weeks ago on another webinar for a group about why we were bullish that this industry would move forward, and that things like Zoom wouldn't replace it entirely or significantly hurt it. And I had ended up coming up with an answer that I described as the 4 C's of citywides to explain that. And those 4 C's are content, connection, commerce, and competition. What we're doing right now is obviously we're sharing content, and Zoom and other forums, virtual forums like this have done a pretty good job with sharing content. If that is the primary or only purpose of what an event is trying to accomplish, this is a pretty good option moving forward. It's not as good of an option for making connections to people. I can see, looking at the participants list on here, that there's 107 right now. There's maybe a little bit of a connection that's been made amongst the panelists because we had a pre-call, and so you get to know people and you hear them and you talk about mutual people you might know and that sort of thing, and maybe that leads to an easy email or phone call down the road where you remember that you had that connection. But the majority of the 107 folks on here, if you don't have an existing relationship with somebody on the panel or with the other participants, you probably aren't making any meaningful connection as a result of a Zoom. With commerce, one of the things we've heard time and time again is that trade shows in particular have really suffered. If you're more educational based, Zoom is doing a pretty good job, but a trade show, you're not really facilitating transactions in a good way for either the seller or the buyer. We have a trade show, for example, called the Fire Department Instructors Conference that meets every year, typically in April, about 35,000 people. And some of them are writing purchase orders for literally tens of millions of dollars, huge fire trucks and equipment and things like that. That show wasn't held at all last year because they just couldn't figure out a way to make that work in a pandemic. And so we're hoping to have that this year again, but that's not unusual. We've heard time and time again, the trade shows are not very good ways, or virtual is not very good ways to execute a trade show. And then finally, competition, as I noted, much of what we've got for the earlier part of 2021 that is still around is competitions. It's volleyball, it's cheerleading, it's basketball, it's NFL Combine. They're all competitive types of things that you just can't do virtually. And so you can't do that. And that's the one thing that's really survived the pandemic better than the other ones. And so we're really bullish that, frankly, and Gus, you mentioned the uncertainty around commercial real estate moving forward, because there are so many surveys that this is permanently changing or will have a long-term impact on the way people do their work, working from home, less dependence on going into an office, particularly in downtown urban centers. And we believe that is true, but we also feel in this industry that that is actually an impetus for people to want to get out and get to a trade show and get to a conference and convention. If you're basically at home most of the time moving forward, instead of going to your office and having that networking with your colleagues, and somebody says, hey, Bob or Mary, do you want to go to that trade show in Indy or Vegas or Orlando or San Francisco? You're like, yes, please, get me on a plane, get me out of here. I got to get somewhere. And so we're quite, again, bullish on that aspect of the changes helping drive our industry forward.
Great, thank you very much, Leonard. And I would encourage just once again, people, that if you have questions, please enter them using the Q&A function. And then also, we have gotten a couple questions and we'll get to those in a minute, but if you could put where it is that you're from, that would be very helpful. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Pollitier. Jason is the Senior Vice President for Community and Economic Development in Michigan for Fifth Third Bank. So Jason, if you want to go ahead, please.
Thanks, Gus. And thank you for having me here to the ULI team. My name is Jason Pollitier, and I serve, as Gus shared, as the North Region Market Manager for Community and Economic Development at Fifth Third Bank. And what that means is that I manage the operations for both our deployment of capital, both human and financial, in collaboration with our lines of business across the bank, for the benefit of the community in compliance with the Community Reinvestment Act. But more importantly, as part of our commitment to corporate social responsibility. And what we're seeing, and you heard Gus talk about it earlier, is that we are in a seller's market, partially driven by the mortgage interest rates being at an all-time low for home mortgages, and partially driven by people's desire to live in larger spaces, as those of us who are able to continue to work from home into the foreseeable future. That said, if you have not had the opportunity to refinance your home or investigate the refinance of your home, now is certainly the time. In Michigan, the governor issued a pause on activities just before Thanksgiving, which was set to expire tomorrow, but then extended it yesterday extended the partial shutdown to December 20th in order to drive down COVID-19 infections and death rates across the state. And for several years, I've been hearing from our partners working on the ground in Grand Rapids on the west side of the state, that there's a low or no supply of housing. So prices have continued to soar there. And I'm seeing the same thing in my own neighborhood here on the east side of the state. When houses go on the market, they are not staying there for long. So while that's good for some of us, there's a whole nother segment of the population for which this rise is causing an affordability crisis. A number of years ago, we partnered with the city of Detroit and Local Initiative Support Coalition, along with Invest Detroit, to establish the Strategic Neighborhoods Fund, which included standing up the Affordable Housing Leverage Fund. And through this fund, what we're working to do is to build or maintain 12,000 affordable housing units throughout the city of Detroit. This fund provides a low interest rate to assist in subsidizing or closing the gap in financing for these units. And more recently, we've heard from a number of our partners working to raise funds to help to stem the tide of potential evictions for those who may have lost their jobs and that have been currently held up between the earlier eviction moratorium and the CARES Act support, which helped to stand up the eviction diversion program here in Michigan, managed by the Michigan State Housing Development Authority. The CARES Act provision sunsets at the end of this month on December 31st, but practitioners are feeling that it's going to take a lot longer than that for us to see jobs come back and for people to recover financially from the pandemic. The city of Detroit is actually using or planning to use some of their CDBG CDBG dollars to continue the program as supply and demand requires. And so that's just a little bit of what we're seeing here on the ground in Michigan, Gus. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jason. Appreciate it. And finally, we are going to talk with Emmett Pearson. And Emmett is the president and CEO of Community Builders of Kansas City. Emmett, take it away, please. And again, just a reminder, please ask Q&A if you'd like to, and we'll get to that once we're done. Thanks.
Thank you, Gus. And thank you to all of you, and good afternoon. Special shout out to my ULI Kansas City colleagues that are on with us today listening. So thank you for always your support of Community Builders of Kansas City. My name is Emmett Pearson Jr., and I'm the president and CEO of Community Builders of Kansas City, which has been around since 1991. We are a not-for-profit community development corporation that runs the gamut of development activities. I have the pleasure of leading a dynamic team, and also the double pleasure of being from this community. I grew up in this community, so it's just a tremendous honor to be able to come back and help the community that I grew up in and continue to serve. As I said, we run the gamut of development activities. We are the master developers for 2 tax increment financing districts. We have over 700 units of affordable housing, 300,000 plus square feet of commercial office retail space. We acquired a grocery store, 55,000 square foot grocery store, so a pretty big grocery store in June. We do institutional development. Over the last 17 years, we've done about $280 million of development, all in the urban core of Kansas City, and primarily an African-American population. So as some of my colleagues have spoke about, we are kind of seeing the gamut of activities. We definitely know the digital divide that exists here in Kansas City's urban core. We understand the affordable housing challenge, particularly with single family for sale, because currently there is not very much new construction going on in Kansas City's urban core, despite the optimism that my colleague Gus has spoken about. So I hope to see that here very shortly. So it is still a challenge here in urban Kansas City. But that's what Community Builders does. We take on those projects that some say can't be done or shouldn't be done. Where I'm coming to you from now, it used to be 25 feet underwater in 1993. And from that, we were able to come and employer cause employs some 1,200 people every day. So we understand the challenges that we are all facing in this pandemic, except where I work and where I grew up, we were always in some level of a pandemic crisis. Right now, the unemployment rate's about 6%. In this community, it's about 14%. We know that communities of color have been hit hardest by COVID-19, and we're seeing that on the ground here. I've kind of talked about some of the brick and mortar things that we do, but we also take the word community extremely serious. That's in our name. We have a very robust engagement process in every project that we do. We do not engage a project of any size unless we are invited in or the community has significant input into how it feels, what's going to be the ultimate exit strategy, if any. So we are happy to engage those questions. But we also do some of the things that we think make community and create healthy communities. I've talked about the brick and mortar, but we also invest in minority businesses. We have currently invested in a for-profit African-American development company. We invested in a small landscaping business that was run by an African-American. We are using some of the land that we own and making those apiaries. I didn't know what an apiary was until one of our partners, who happens to be my wife, is now into beekeeping and really taking the idea from blighted to beautiful to heart. And so we are engaged with her and the students of some of the local schools here to get them into beekeeping. So it's just not about the brick and mortar side of development and economic development. It's also about the other things that make a community. So with that, because I know we want to get to our fireside chat, I'm going to be quiet and let Gus turn it back over and hopefully talk about some other challenges that are going on here in the urban core. So with that, Gus, back to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Emmett. I appreciate it. We have gotten a few questions in. I had some questions that were pre-submitted, so we'll get to those. One of the first ones, the questions that I want to answer, and this is from Garnet Vaughn, and I'm sorry, I don't know where Mr. Vaughn is from, but he said there was a video breakup and what were the housing numbers? So I took the opportunity to look those up. So we saw between February and April, we saw total housing starts fall by about 50%. So they're running at an annualized pace of almost 1.6 million in February. Those fell to about 900,000 in April. But since then, they've come back and they're only just a little bit below where they were in February, at about 1.5 million at an annualized rate. Similarly, in terms of existing home sales, we saw about a 40% drop there between February and April. They were about, a little under 6 million in an annual rate, fell to about 4 million in an annual rate. They're actually now back above where they were in February. So, we've had some of our panelists talk about this, the strong rebound that we're seeing in the housing market. They were almost 7 million at an annualized rate in October. And that really takes us back more than a decade to, the housing market boom that we saw a decade or so ago there. So a really strong rebound that we've been seeing in the housing market. So one of the questions that came in, and I'd like to ask Leonard this, is, Leonard, so you've talked about the convention business, and how that is, how obviously that's been enormously disrupted by the pandemic. But what about the associated hotel business, hotel construction, that type of thing, and what's going on there, both as it relates to Indianapolis, but also around the country?
Yeah, I think nationally and in Indy that a huge amount of hotel development has stopped. We had a ton of stuff in the pipeline that STR and CBRE, the big firms that track the hotel world, were tracking, that have since gone radio silent. Either the projects have quietly died and just simply not been reported back, or they're on an indefinite hold. One of the unusual things for Indy, however, is one big project that we had been working on, which was a phase 6 expansion of our convention center. The original center was opened in 1972, and phase 5 was opened in 2011. We've been working on a phase 6, and that would come with a 50,000 square foot ballroom, a bunch of additional meeting space. It would connect to our existing center. It would have an 800 room Signia Hilton hotel attached to it, which is the Hilton brand's competitor to JW that they're starting to roll out, with one in Atlanta, one in Orlando, and potentially one in Indy. That project was thought that it wasn't going to have any legs moving forward either, but as it turns out, the developer, our city and community all wanted to see it happen, with the feeling that if we approved it this year and it broke ground in 2022, it would open in 2025. And looking at STR and CBRE forecasts, they were all confident that the hotel market would return to its 2019 demand levels and by end of 2023 and to total revenue levels. So price would lag behind room demand, but that would eventually catch up by 2024. That if we'd have to do something now to break ground in 22 and to open it in 25, and you'd be opening in recovery. Pretty bold move. And as it turns out, in September, our city county council, in a bipartisan, obviously, manner, because this was unanimous, voted 25-0 to issue 155 million in bonds to do that expansion and to allow the developer to connect to it. And so it's very Indy, frankly. Some of you know the story that in 1983 we built a football stadium and had no team, and then we went out and got the Baltimore Colts to become the Indianapolis Colts a year later. Shortly after 9/11, we started developing plans to build a new airport, which eventually opened in 2008, which seemed crazy at the time. And so now in the middle of a pandemic, we voted 25-0 to spend 150 plus million on bonds for a convention center expansion. But again, the timing, there will be virtually nothing happening. From what I can tell, St. Louis is doing something like this right now, where they're doing a smaller renovation of their space primarily. But at virtually every hotel, significant, major, maybe the limited services, smaller properties are happening, but the big ones are not happening almost anywhere. So this is really an anomaly, and you'll see a bunch of projects start popping up in 26 and 27 because they won't start getting approved until 21 and 22. But this one happened in 2020 to open for 2025. So very unusual, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Leonard. Appreciate it. And so I guess this question would go to Emmett, which is, what are you seeing in the marketplace as it relates to urban community economic development?
So, Gus, thanks for the question. And I kind of alluded to some of the things I'm seeing in my opening remarks. Again, where we build, it's always a challenge, access to capital. That extends into individual business owners. This community, for the most part, not everybody, but for the most part, really did not participate in the PPP loans. When you have a community that has 2 banks within the urban core of Kansas City, it's tough many times to do business with banks if you don't see a bank or you have a bank that's in your immediate community. So we have that. Loan to value has always been a challenge, again, in our projects and in this community. What we're seeing now is that banks are requiring higher equity requirements. We have 2 projects that we're looking to break ground on in the next 30 days. One is a 64 unit, $12.5 million. We call it market rate, but it's still 80% below median income project. And again, our capital equity requirement has gone up from what it was 6 months ago. As well as we have another larger project that's a 60,000 square foot office building, yes, office building in this COVID time, because we are betting that COVID will be manageable, especially with the vaccines coming on board. And so we are looking, 2 years from now. And so we are in deep conversations with an anchor tenant to do a 60,000 square foot office building, Class A office building. So again, we are optimistic, but again, it's still a challenge. And many of the things that we're seeing here, unemployment is still high, as I said. We find that banks, so sorry, bankers, are hoarding cash. We understand that, but again, when it's already a challenge to get access to capital, and we know the banks are hoarding cash, it makes it very difficult to do projects in urban communities in and of itself in a non-pandemic time, let alone now. So that's just some of the things we're seeing. You know, and again, as I said, there's no single family new construction going on here in urban Kansas City other than in the controversial Beacon Hills, which I think Mayor Garrett kind of alluded to, which is arguably being gentrified. So that's it.
Okay. Do any of our other panelists have anything to say about community and economic development taking place in urban centers?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so just to Emmett's points, one of the things that we're seeing is a rise in the activities that our CDFI partners are having during this time, and some of the, I mentioned earlier, some of the funds that folks are looking to raise. So early on in the pandemic, we worked particularly closely with a couple of local CDFIs in order to ensure that bigger swaths of the community were able to take advantage of the PPP program, both within Fifth Third Bank, but also through the CDFI partners that we work with for those who, quote unquote, did not qualify for PPP, right? And so Develop Detroit, or not Develop Detroit, Detroit Development Fund, as an example, set up a fund, an emergency assistance fund for small businesses in collaboration with their Entrepreneurs of Color Fund in order to get PPP type dollars to some of those small businesses who were unable to affect it or to utilize it. But the other thing I talked about, the Affordable Housing Leverage Fund that we established here. So also working with LISC, which is one of the largest CDFIs in the country, set up the Housing for the Future Fund, which is also helping to bring some of the affordable housing development to fruition. So I would wholeheartedly suggest that Emmett, if the CDFIs aren't active in your market, that we work to try to make that happen for you there in Kansas City.
Great, thank you very much. Any other comments from our panelists on that question?
So I just wanted to add, this is more on the municipal government front, but specifically for the borough of Wilkinsburg, as I mentioned earlier, we're so closely located to the city of Pittsburgh. A lot of people believe we're a neighborhood of Pittsburgh. And 2020 has really, again, when I was talking about re-envisioning innovative solutions, we're really taking a look at what actually a consolidation or merger with the city of Pittsburgh would look like for some of the initiatives that Emmett and Jason, you mentioned, that are happening in your city. But there's a lot of programming specifically towards housing fund initiatives and redevelopment specifically into underconnected and or Black communities that a borough like Wilkinsburg doesn't benefit from because we're not technically a part of the city of Pittsburgh. So really weighing what that pros and what the cons would be, because we've reached a certain point where we've gotten Wilkinsburg so far, but to break to that next level to help lower the tax burden and also bring in responsible and inclusive new development to Wilkinsburg, that's where we're exploring right now. So I just wanted to share that more so on the municipal government front.
All right, thank you very much, Mayor Garrett. So this is
I was just going to add one thing to that too. The project that I talked about is in fact right in the urban center, that $155 million expansion. And something related to this, I think that's an interesting project for ULI listeners, is that we have a site called the General Motors stamping plant, which is immediately west of our urban core, immediately west of the river, White River, that runs through downtown Indianapolis. And it's lay fallow for probably going on 2 decades. It was a former manufacturing facility for General Motors. And just last week, Elanco, which is the Eli Lilly animal sciences and agricultural firm announced it's going to build a global headquarters at the center of that site. And the state is then going to surround that global headquarters with an expansion of the White River State Park, which is where our zoo and other things are like. So I think there's still some big projects whenever you have a good piece of land with an opportunity either in the urban core or right on the edge that the people are starting to look for opportunities now that we see light at the end of the COVID tunnel.
Great, thank you very much, Leonard. So our next question comes in from actually my friend Robin Zufilik, who's based here in Pittsburgh. And Robin asks, what are your thoughts on how to leverage public-private partnerships along with information to the new Biden administration to increase the pace of infrastructure improvement in public transportation, broadband, and 5G? And I guess, at least in terms of the broadband and 5G portion, Mike, do you have any thoughts on that?
So, yeah, great question, Rob. And I think, with 5G, obviously it's fifth generation technology. I think it's going to be something that's going to be around for a very long time. And I think that the Biden administration coming in is going to propel this effort forward, in my opinion. And so, I think about how this would, in terms of our discussion today, in terms of what we're talking about, I think agility is going to be the real currency here, being flexible in this space, continuing to embrace, creativity, responding to customers' needs as they evolve. And so I think 5G kind of speaks to that. Obviously, there's huge benefits to it. One of the things we're doing, I think, in this space in terms of evolution as well is what I think, and with Comcast is in the space of Internet Essentials, where we're working alongside of schools in the community, particularly McKeesport is one where we're partnering with those schools to bring schools more internet availability into their markets for low-income families. And so, that's kind of our big bet on just trying to make certain we're there answering the bell for the community as these new needs arise. And it's really about, just being flexible in this space. I think another space too, just to spin off of that a little bit, I have to kind of speak to this piece on racial injustice is something that I wanted to kind of get out a little bit. I mean, lots of investments in this space across the country as well. And I think, when I think about the city of Pittsburgh specifically and companies in Pittsburgh, benefit from increased population and diverse employee base. So, now is a great time to advocate for diversity in your respective organizations. And again, double down on your values. It could be, it could serve financially. We do know that there's a business case in diversity. One example with Comcast here would be with spending money to support local Black-owned businesses and the RISE program that we launched, which really puts money back in the pockets of small businesses right in the heart of the city of Pittsburgh. So, and I think that in itself also brings about customer loyalty to our brand and to any brand of any consumer that invests in that space.
Okay. Any thoughts from any other of our panelists about infrastructure investment, whether it's in public transportation or any other aspect, and possible initiatives with the Biden administration?
I can tell you from a community builder's perspective, we were working on a plan, particularly for infrastructure. Again, urban cities typically have older infrastructure, sewers, all that good stuff. And so we were trying to work on, quite candidly, get a set aside for those not-for-profits doing urban economic development of a 1% set aside in whatever infrastructure bill comes out in this next Congress. Because again, those that are on the ground in these communities know where best to place the infrastructure. And so, we're trying to make that happen along with some other initiatives, particularly around housing and expanding the bond cap and things like that.
Great. Thank you very much, Emmett. So that's all the questions that we have. If anybody wants to ask one really quickly, we might have time to get to it. But in the meantime, why don't we, if in Emmett, since you're already on, if you could just give us your final thoughts for 30 seconds or so, and then we'll go through the rest of the panelists.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, thank you to ULI for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation with my colleagues here. And, in 30 seconds, the simple thing is as I was talking this morning on another panel, we have to become more of a nation and a community of we versus me, because we are all struggling in some form or another. I can tell you Black and brown communities are struggling mightily. So compound what they were already going through, and now compound that with what's going on with COVID. And, the conversation around inequities, particularly around, hit hardest Black and brown communities, may be some of the last to get the vaccine. I hope that's not the case. So just remember, we versus me.
Great. Jason, do you have any parting thoughts? Jason,
Yes.
you're on. Oh, go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah. So as we continue to think about this affordable housing issue, let's not. Obviously, we're thinking about the tenants in this space and making sure that folks continue to remain housed. But let's not forget about the landlords, right? The tenants and the landlords are intricately synced together, and I know Emmett, as an owner of multiple real estate projects there in Kansas City, can appreciate that. But yeah, let's remember that, like Emmett said, we're all in this together, and let's not forget about the landlords. Thank you, Gus.
Okay. Thank you very much. Leonard?
Thank you, Gus, and thanks to all the panelists for your insights. I've really enjoyed listening to all of you, and I appreciate having been here today. I would just summarize my world by saying, by basically paraphrasing a misquote from Mark Twain, that the reports of the demise of the convention and tourism world have been greatly exaggerated. And the same thing I think goes for urban cores and downtowns. And, are we going to recover in 2021 fully? No. Or even 2022. But if you were to exaggerate this out to say 2030, the thought of folks not getting on planes and traveling globally and experiencing the unique sights and sounds of the world, or going to a trade show or convention, or enjoying an NBA game or an NFL game in the downtown and going to dinner beforehand, that's not going to be permanently going away. Those are things that are coming back. There's a lot of folks who want you to believe that the world is permanently changed, and there are going to be permanent changes. There's definitely going to be things that are different that we will have all learned from this process. But the actual, permanent elimination of conventions, trade shows, global travel, vibrant urban downtowns, that's all coming back.
Okay, thank you very much. Mike, any closing thoughts?
Thank you, Gus, and to the panelists today, and for ULI, obviously, for hosting this event. I would just say, in the world of the digital divide, I'd like to just kind of spend a moment speaking about how prevalent that discussion has become these days as we work remotely, and for who knows how long, kids will be educating. And one of our panelists have 8 kids at home now in the school. And so just to think about that, and the fact that, if you didn't have an opportunity to access broadband or data in that world, what would you do? I mean, how would you fairly compete in a world where, everything is uneven? And we've seen that. Obviously, we've come from those days, and we're making great progress. We haven't arrived yet socially, obviously, in terms of that space, but also technologically as well. And I just want to talk about the fact that we're here to make a big bet on trying to address it.
Great. And finally, Mayor Garrett.
Yeah, so thank you again, ULI. A great panel, great job, Gus. So I just want to leave here, and actually, I think I said this earlier on another call as well too. But we've seen what isn't working. We've seen what isn't sustainable. So this is 2020 has really presented an opportunity for us to reroute and re-navigate into what could be, and really get innovative, so that God forbid another pandemic happens, but or yet, that there won't be one population suffering from the worst, that if we're suffering then worse than the other, so that if we're really talking about equitable, sustainable options and what's best for our regions, now is the time to really implement that.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you very much to all of our panelists and all of our attendees this afternoon. And then let me pass it back to Shannon.
Wow. Thank you so much, Gus. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for contributing your time and talent and passion with all of us today. And more importantly, thank you for doing all of the work that you do to make your communities a better place. I think that we all learned a lot from each other today. And I hope that this is just one step forward in future collaborations. I really appreciate all of you spending time with us today. What an amazing discussion. And I also want to make sure that all of you have on your calendars for next week, next Tuesday, we have the closing out event for this Emerging Trends series. We will be joined by Candace Friedman from Modern Ventures, who will be talking about her venture capital firm in property technologies, and then followed up by a conversation from representatives from all of our cities who are working on future technologies. So thanks so much for telling us a little bit about what to expect in the near future today. And next week, we look forward to talking about what will be in the far future. So thanks again. I appreciate all of you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe and stay healthy. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.